Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video, and today we're going to be looking at the 2024 presidential election. If each party, in this case, will be starting off with the Democratic Party, runs their worst possible candidate. Now, I'm going to acknowledge that these scenarios are not at all likely. For example, as you can see, Nancy Pelosi being the Democratic nominee is never going to happen. I say that with full confidence. Now, as for how I determined who the worst candidate would be, I didn't really make a model or anything. I just essentially off the top of my head. Now, you could make an argument for a lot of people, and I did consider a few people for the Democrats. Um, I considered AOC for their worst candidate. I considered Chuck Schumer. I think I considered Andrew Cuomo. But I think Pelosi. I mean, Cuomo is a really close second. But I just think Pelosi right now. I'm still going to have her be the Democratic Party's worst candidate for 2024. Although again, that could change. Now, for the Republicans, I try to find their best candidates. So, for those of you who've watched my channel for at least a little bit, know that I think that Ron DeSantis is the Republican Party's most electable candidate. So I'm going to go with him. So, without further ado, let's get started with our safe Pelosi states. There are not going to be too many. Hawaii, blue enough state for it to be safe for Pelosi. Her home state of California is safe. Maryland, D.C., Massachusetts, Vermont. New York would be safe, although it would be like only 15 or 16%. The first district of Maine, actually no, it would not be. The first district of Maine would not be safe. So yeah, now that's 113 electoral votes for Nancy Pelosi. Safe for DeSantis, he'd carry a lot of states by safe margins. All of these, Kansas, he'd win easily by over 20%. Texas, he'd probably win by 14 or 15, maybe 16. Win all these states safe. He'd win Iowa and Ohio safe. I say that without a doubt. He'd probably actually do better in Iowa and Ohio. He'd probably win, maybe Iowa by 16 or 17, and Ohio by 14 or 15. So they'd be similar to Texas. He'd come very close winning Florida safe, by the way, just to put that out there. And then he'd win the second district and Maine safe. So, none of these safes just for DeSantis are flips, but they're telling because, Texas was likely in 2020. Kansas was almost likely, I think. Ohio and Iowa were likely. Maine second district was likely. Mississippi was pretty close to likely, as was Montana. So, a lot of these states are very, very, DeSantis would be running, ahead of Trump by more than 10%, which is telling. So for a likely Pelosi state, she'd still probably win Washington by a likely margin. Now, the reason that it isn't safe is because Washington, there is a bit of elasticity kind of in the eastern part of the state. She'd obviously do very well in Seattle and King County. She actually wouldn't do too much worse than Biden. I still think that there'd be a drop off, but it wouldn't be enough to make the county any more competitive. It's still a safe Democrat county, but the Republicans have actually won a few statewide races in Washington recently. Now, these are anomalies, they're like random state auditor races that no one cares about, but they're still important because there is a Republican base in the state of Washington. And I think that, DeSantis can run it up in Spokane, Tacoma, suburbs of Seattle to make Pelosi win it by under 12%. She'd also probably carry Illinois by a likely margin. I mean, I just don't see her getting the Chicago, because Illinois, the state as a whole, is still pretty red, but it's just that Cook County and Chicago just overpowers the rest of the state to give it to the Democrats. So I think that, so I think that Illinois is going to be a state that, she could do poorly in Cook County and win it by 8 to 10%. So yeah, she'd also carry, some of these northeastern states that are just going to be likely. Just generally speaking, these states are usually safe for the Democratic Party, but in 2016, a lot of them were likely, and if the Democrats ran someone bad in 2024, they could absolutely narrow up. So Delaware, New Jersey, these are states that, Delaware was I think, a 10-point Clinton state in 2016. We'd see a similar thing with Pelosi. I'd assume maybe she'd do even worse. Maybe she'd win by 7 or 8, just because Delaware is a state where Democrats, they consistently win here, but they win by in between 10 to 25, so Pelosi, being a terrible candidate, would find a way to make this be only single digits. New Jersey is a state where the Republicans, Chris Christie recently won a statewide race. They've won statewide races as recently as 2013 with Chris Christie. They also kind of have a suburban base, and Pelosi isn't really well liked by anybody. To be completely honest, I think that her suburban base, or she doesn't really have a base. I think that the suburbs would come out for DeSantis against her, which would make the state be, on the lower end of likely. I think she'd win New Jersey by only 5 to 7%. Connecticut and Rhode Island, these are states that have significant working class populations, especially Connecticut. In regions like Stamford and the southern part of the state. I think Pelosi or DeSantis could really run it up there, as well as the rural counties, but there aren't too many of those in either of these New England states, and if they are, they're not as red as other rural areas of America. So I think Pelosi still finds a way to win them, but by under 12%. And I think Connecticut is the closest being queen. I think she only wins Connecticut by 5. Because remember, in 2018, even in a blue wave, Ned Lamont only won his gubernatorial election by 3%. He was very unpopular at the time, but Pelosi, don't see her doing too much better than him. First district of Maine, I originally going to have it as safe. Obviously, this is a district that even Hillary Clinton won by a safe margin, but in the 2020 Senate race where Susan Collins won the state of Maine, she actually did make the district a lean Democratic district. So I still think that it's a district that could narrow up to a 10 or 11% margin of victory for Pelosi. DeSantis, his likely states, I think he wins Arizona by a likely margin. I think he wins Nevada by a likely margin. He carries Nebraska by a likely margin. He carries Wisconsin as well as Pennsylvania by a likely margin. He also wins Florida, his home state. And the tipping point here would be Georgia by a likely margin. So these are a lot of states that we have to get into, but I think Nevada and Arizona for similar reasons. Well, actually, not for similar reasons. I think Nevada, first of all, Pelosi gets terrible turnout from Clark County, doesn't do too well in Washoe. She probably loses Washoe by somewhere in between 3 and 5%, and as a result loses the state by a little over 5 or 6. I just think that the Royals just come out hard against her, and Clark, she just doesn't get the turnout she needs to offset those losses. So Nevada, likely Republican. In Arizona, we see a thing where we have suburbanites going towards DeSantis because they are turned off by Pelosi and how polarizing she is. And there would be a lot of Biden-DeSantis voters in this case, and DeSantis just mobilizes the rural voters to go up against Pelosi. In Florida, his home state, he has the benefit of being from the state, being the governor. He's pretty popular, though I think he makes inroads with Hispanics and and holds the state for the Republicans. I mean, Florida's been a state that has been trending to the right over the past couple of years. So I still do think that Florida would be a state that's favored to go Republican in 2022. But with DeSantis it being his home state and Pelosi being a terrible candidate overall, she'd still probably lose it by 9 to 10%. Georgia would vote to the left of Florida again. It would probably be a 6-point DeSantis state, but being realistic here, I don't see a way that Pelosi gets anywhere close to the turnout that Biden got from Atlanta, and that dooms her in the state. She does a little worse in suburbs, but it's mostly her problem in Atlanta. But of course, she does worse basically everywhere, just mostly Atlanta. Wisconsin, she does awful. I mean, awful with the working class. She just cannot, make inroads with them at all. She does significantly worse than 2016 Hillary Clinton, which is already pretty bad for Democrats. I mean, she lost Wisconsin, but Pelosi does worse than Clinton with the working class. She does worse in the inner cities like Milwaukee. She does worse inside of cities like Milwaukee and Madison. For that reason, I think that she loses Wisconsin by just barely a likely margin. And, I could be wrong. Maybe it falls in the lean category, but it's still a state that would be likely for DeSantis in the scenario. Pennsylvania, similar thing. DeSantis makes inroads in the suburbs. He does well in the rurals. Possibly outrunning Trump 2020 in some of these areas, and the working class, especially in Western Pennsylvania, still comes out hard against Pelosi. So yeah. Now for the lean Pelosi states, I think she only wins Oregon by 4 or 5, which again is telling because of how solidly blue the state is. She does worse in the suburbs and worse in the rurals, but manages to hold on as a result of the Democratic Party just having a solid enough base in Portland to carry them over the edge. There are a lot of white liberals in the Northeast, or in the Pacific Northwest, that would be enough for Pelosi to win, even though she's a terrible candidate for these regions. Colorado, I still think she takes Colorado by a lean margin. Again, similar to Washington and Oregon, there are a lot of white liberals who would be energized to vote for her. So I think for that reason, she still does win these states, but by reduced margins. I mean, she does, Biden won Oregon by I think 14 or 15. She probably wins Oregon by 4 or 5, so she does 10 points worse in Oregon than Biden. Biden won Colorado by 11. I think she wins it by, 2 or 3, so she does 8 to 9 points worse than Biden in Colorado. Then she also, I think she takes Virginia by just 2%. It's barely a lean. But, Virginia's just so far gone for the Republicans that, they're still doing pretty well in the rurals, but there's just not a ton of room for DeSantis to improve on Trump. And obviously, it does trend to the right because, Trump, he lost it by 10 in 2020. I still think DeSantis improves by 7-8% on that. But there's just not anywhere, there's not a realistic path to victory for the Republicans in Virginia at the presidential level anytime soon. Now, for our lean DeSantis states, I think he wins Minnesota by a lean margin. He also wins Michigan by a lean margin. So, give that to DeSantis. Minnesota, just the suburbs just come out hard against Pelosi. I don't see her doing too much worse than Biden in Minneapolis, but she still just does worse in the boroughs with the working class and the Iron Age. In the suburbs, of course, would swing hard for the Republican Party. In Michigan, we see, the working class coming out. The auto industry would definitely not support Pelosi. They definitely go for DeSantis in this scenario. And the suburbs would, again, as I've been saying this the whole video, do not like Pelosi. She would lose in the suburbs. Now, I think that's going to be it for us. Actually, no, we're going to give North Carolina and New Hampshire lean margins. I think New Hampshire's closer to tilt than North Carolina was, but it's still decently close. I think North Carolina Pelosi manages to lose it by under 5, but she doesn't do well enough with black voters to make this any less of a DeSantis victory, and any less than DeSantis plus 3. And I think she just doesn't get this will be a terrible turnout election for Democrats. So I think North Carolina is going to be lean for DeSantis, and it could even be likely. I'm still not sure. New Hampshire is a state where the Democratic Party has been winning they've been on a bit of a winning streak in New Hampshire, but they still there's still a path to victory for Republicans, and especially if they get the support from white voters that they need. So yeah, and I forgot to mention that Pelosi does win. Actually, no, hold on. So yeah, so now going on to our tilt states, Pelosi would carry. I think that she carries Maine at large by a tilt margin. She wins it by probably 1%. I could see DeSantis winning it, especially after Susan Collins won in 2020, but still not a very, it's still not reliable enough. Collins winning in a Senate race, I don't really want to compare that necessarily to a presidential race. So for that reason, I'll go with my gut and say Pelosi wins it by under 1%, but still very close. Lastly, New Mexico is going to be the closest state. I think it's decided by just a couple thousand votes, but DeSantis wins it, and this might be a surprise. I think a lot of you expecting Pelosi to at least win New Mexico, but hear me out. I think DeSantis makes improvements with Hispanics. Going against the trend that incumbents usually do better with Hispanics, Pelosi would not have the advantage of being an incumbent, and she would also have the DeSantis would also have the added bonus of being from a state that has a big Hispanic population. So New Mexico, and especially with Pelosi not getting the turnout she needs from these urban areas. So I think New Mexico narrowly goes for Ron DeSantis. But that's it for this video, guys. 206 electoral votes for Nancy Pelosi, 332 for Ron DeSantis. So I hope you enjoyed. And part 2 will be for the Democratic Party, their landslide scenario. So that's it. Thank you. Goodbye.